Hi everyone, thank you for the opportunity to present today my research about excitatory-inhibitory dynamics in adaptive decision making. So I started this work as I was finishing my PhD with Doina Prekup at McGill and Mila. This work is based on two observations. So the first one is that adaptive decision making is essential for survival in dynamic environments or uncertain environments. And the other is that a fundamental principle of neural networks in the brain is Dale's law or Dale's principles, which states that neurons are either excitatory or inhibitory based on the neurotransmitters that they release at all of their synapses. So here we investigate decision-selective VI dynamics, how decision-selective VI dynamics could contribute to flexible behavior. And basically we do this by investigating two canonical connectivity motifs, recurrent excitation and inhibitory feedback. So we investigate selective VI dynamics in adaptive decision-making across three scales of abstraction. So the first one is the analytic level. So here we use decision-selective mean field model to probe the functional roles of these two motifs. To isolate them. And then at the algorithmic level, we put the CI principles in an RL agent in the preference functions to see how these interactions modify behavioral adaptability to dynamic environments. And finally, at the architectural level, we take two EI-constrained recurrent neural networks and to see how these motifs appear in learnable models in the same kind of tasks, so in dynamic tasks. So first, we investigate this EI mean field models, where we have here two excitatory populations, which receive some ambiguous input signals, and they're placed in like a two-arm bandit, so a decision-making task, a two-choice decision-making task, and the decision is read out from the excitatory populations, which are recurrent, and they also receive input from the inhibitory populations, which we don't model to be recurrent. And we investigate these two motifs here. So we observe that when we increase recurrent excitation, this tends to amplify signals, and we'll split, here I'm plotting the phase space activity of the excitatory populations. And we see that one attractor point is going to split into two attractor points separated by a saddle point as we increase recurrent excitation, and the two attractor points are going to correspond to the two decisions. When we add IPSI-specific inhibition, which means that the inhibitory populations are going to be connected to excitatory populations selective for the same choice, we see that this is going to oppose excitation, and the attractor points are going to coalesce together, and the decision boundaries are going to soften. So this is going to introduce stability into the system. And when we add contrast-specific inhibition, which just means that the inhibitory populations are going to inhibit excitatory populations of opposite choice. This is going to drive competition into the circuit and between the two decisions. And in this case, it's going to destabilize the dynamics by sending the attractor points at infinity. So then we introduce these EI principles in an RL agent, and we put them in the preference function of an RL agent, where we have here two excitatory action value functions and two inhibitory action value functions for each action, which receive different input signals. So one of them integrates rewards and the other reward prediction errors. And we also have a recurrent policy, which integrates the preference function, the excitatory preference function using a precision parameter. By scaling it up. And this precision parameter is going to correspond functionally, not necessarily biologically correlated to the recurrent excitation that I talked previously. And we're going to look at these two values to see if we encounter the same kind of observation that we saw in the mean field model. Here I'm plotting the log policy space on the X and Y dimension, and on the Z dimension. Oh, sorry, I should have said here, we test this agent in a dynamic task. So here we have a reversal learning paradigm where we have the task is just the environment is Bernoulli bandit with those probabilities, and the arms which give positive reward with those probabilities, and the arms are going to switch every 1,000 time steps, as in the reversal learning paradigm. So here I'm plotting on the Z dimension, I'm plotting time, and so basically the trajectories are going to oscillate between the two decisions. When we have, and what we see is this high precision setting, which corresponds to functionally with the same setting as we had previously with increased recurrent excitation. We see that the networks, the circuit adapts, the agent adapts over time. But when we add IPSI-specific inhibition, this is going to cause the same kind of behavior that we saw earlier. So the attractor points are going to coalesce together. And this is, in terms of performance, in terms of average reward, we see that better adaptation due to the increased stability that we have into the system. In contrast, when we add contrast-specific inhibition, we see that the same behavior that we saw in the mean field model, that the attractor points are more distant. And this is going to drive competition between the two decisions. And in terms of performance, we see more variability in the trajectories and worse performance. And in the low precision setting, which would correspond to less recurrent excitation, as we saw previously, the network basically underfits the task, and IPSI-specific inhibition is not going to help because it's going to over-stabilize the system, so lead to over-regularization. But contrast-specific inhibition, because it's driving competition between the two decisions, is going to lead to better performance by driving the acceleration in the agent. Finally, we investigate the same two things in EI-constrained recurrent neural networks. We test three architectures. The first one is like a vanilla RNN as baseline, which has no constraints on the weights. And then we also test two EI-constrained neural networks. The first one, which differ in terms of their connectivity structure and the biological interpretations. So here, this first one, column-based EI-RNN, partitions the excitatory neurons and the inhibitory neurons. The excitatory neurons are with pink and the inhibitory neurons with green. And so we have column-based partitioning where the excitatory neurons are going to only have weights going outward, which are positive, and the inhibitory ones only negative weights. Which are clipped to have this sign constraint. And so these networks are pretty general and admit basically broader inhibitory motifs. Whereas the other network, there's artificial neural networks, place the inhibitory neurons in between excitatory neurons and only allow for local inhibition. But the positive thing is that the weight matrix for the recurrence is actually unconstrained, even though we constrain all of the individual weights between excitatory, inhibitory, and inhibitory excitatory. The overall weight matrix is allowed to take any form. Which leads to better optimization properties. So we test these networks first in a fixed contextual decision-making task by supervised learning, where the networks are trained to integrate an ambiguous input signal, the gray area, and then which tells them to raise one of the two arms of a two-choice bandit, corresponding to the input that they receive. And then they're trained to maintain that performance after the stimulus has ended. So we see that all of the networks are basically able to perform the task, more or less. But when we look at the phase space activity, so the slow points of the RNN, and we project them in PC space, we see that the vanilla RNN is able to find two clusters corresponding to the two decisions, the blue ones and the pink ones, which are well separated, and trajectories from the starting point with green lead to one of the two. And the same is true for Dale's artificial neural network, so the right plot. We also see a similar behavior, whereas for column-based EI RNNs, we see that their attractors are poorly separated and sometimes overlapping, and their trajectories are quite noisy. In terms of performance, both of the EI RNNs are slower to converge, but they kind of converge to the same performance as the RNN. And we also see that the column-based EI RNN it struggles more with ambiguous trials. So trials where the stimulus, where it is harder to determine which of the arms is correct based on the contextual information. So finally, we also test them in these dynamic tasks where we have like the environment is resampled from a structured distributions. So here I'm showing an example where the environment is sampled from a correlated Bernoulli bandit with some probabilities for the two arms, but this also works on other distributions like restless bandits or other drifts or other probabilities. So this is kind of like a meta-learning setting where, they receive also the previous action and the previous rewards. And so in terms of performance, we see with green that column-based EI RNNs are very slow to converge. And then we also do an ablation study where we remove global inhibition, and we see that with only local inhibition, this tends to lead to better optimization. But nowhere as near as Dale's artificial neural networks, which are quite robust and lead to almost as good performance as vanilla RNNs. So we can train EI constrained networks and obtain similar performance in this kind of tasks. So finally, to summarize, so we explored the EI interactions in adaptive decision making. And using an EI mean field model, we saw that these dynamics modulate between stability and competition. When we embed them in the preference function of an RL agent, we saw that these interactions affect behavioral adaptation to dynamic environments, dynamic tasks. And in EI RNN-based agents, we saw that this EI partitioning of the latent space of an RNN and the connectivity structure actually impacts optimization. And as future direction, we want to look at EI dynamics in continual learning because here I was just talking about a particular distribution, but not about a non-stationary distribution. And we also want to look at global inhibition, incorporate other inhibitory cell types and distinct connectivity patterns, as well as possibly other biological details such as homeostasis or spike rate adaptation. And with that, I want to thank you.
Thank you for the talk. How would you approach continual learning in this setting?
So here I have like a fixed distribution, a structured distribution that I keep sampling from. So I'm testing on the same distribution that I've trained on. So it's not really continual learning, I think, because in continual learning we would test on a different distribution than we actually trained on, or similar to that. I also tested on that, but I didn't find anything sufficiently interesting to show because I only tested like very similar distributions. I didn't test like in a non-stationary setting, yes. Completely non-stationary.
Okay, so what would you think, how would behavior complex inhibitory circuitry structure and everything in the situation of continual learning. Different set of track. What might happen? Different set of attractors. So what? I'm just curious.
I think possibly my speculation would be that you would need to tune this balance dynamically, because the balance is important for how fast or how slow you adapt to changing tasks. So if your dynamics are slowly changing, then you should adapt slowly and stably. But if your dynamics are, if your environment keeps changing really rapidly, then you should probably enforce a different strategy and increase this rapid adaptation by changing the balance such that you rapidly adapt to the task. So yeah, the connectivity structure should kind of like pick up on the speed of which the environment is changing.
Nice talk. We've noticed in our own experiments on recurrent neural networks that the initialization and training schedule sort of affects the end solution. So I was just wondering if, so you showed us phase plots and talked about one specific example. Just wondering if you looked at the stability of those solutions across different training runs.
So I didn't look at different initialization schemes because I kind of like followed up on previous work, which was already doing that and showing kind of like the right initialization such that is comparable to a vanilla RNN. So I didn't want to change that because I assume that if you change that, you just bias the RNN. So we wanted to test like in the same kind of setting as the other.